Junko glanced over at Stahl and smiled briefly. Did you enjoy your time back on your own ship? They were walking through the halls of the Retribution on their way to Andromeda's private section of the ship. It's very strange to be the captain of a ship that seems to always be operating without me, he answered with a sigh. Once the fleet splits up, I won't have to constantly come over here, but I will admit I'll miss some certain people. He smiled at Junko and she flushed a little. The officer had always been very nice to her. Truthfully, no one had been mean to her except perhaps Andromeda at times, but Stahl was especially nice. Well, I'll miss seeing you around as well. You have a very calming effect on our beloved leader. She smiled again for a moment, but the smile faded as she began to worry about what Andromeda might require of her as the campaign wore on. Then she continued as she tried to push that thought to the back of her head. I do appreciate you describing some of the Admiral's battles to Cassis. You understand the mechanics much better than I do, and it certainly helps that you were there for a number of them. Junko mentioned as she looked over at him. Stahl shrugged slowly. I'm beginning to think Andromeda simply wants me to stay here as her good luck charm, he muttered. Always having me show up for these meetings with new Xenos. I can't tell if she's trying to expose me to more creatures and broaden my horizon, or she just knows how much it annoys me to be kept from my ship, so she requests it constantly. Well, as I mentioned, I'm thankful for your presence even so. Junko knew Stahl was getting tired of constantly being called over to the ship, but she hoped he wasn't too fed up with it. Then again, considering the kind of officer he was, she'd likely never know besides an offhanded comment. Soon enough, they were walking into the museum in progress Andromeda had set up for her father. Cassis was already standing near the table waiting for them. Hello, Captain Stahl. Executive Assistant Junko, he said in English, nodding to each of them. He had been working on his pronunciation of English words over the last few days, since the prince had come out of the vault. Junko was fairly sure he was doing anything he could to stay out of Andromeda's suite. So he'd been learning all he could about Satanists, the modern ones anyway, and practicing his language skills. Hello, Captain Deveros, Stahl replied with a nod in turn. Junko noticed that Stahl was being more courteous with the Xeno than he had been before as well. Was it because Cassis was thinking of converting to Satanism? Or did Stahl just feel sorry for the Xeno whose perception of his own country was being so completely shaken? Hello, Cassis, Junko responded with a smile. She wasn't much for formal titles. I take it you didn't have too much trouble clearing your schedule to join us here. She spoke in English, curious to see if he'd catch her meaning. The Xeno seemed to think over her words for a moment. I have no schedule. He tilted his head as he looked confused before nodding. Yes, this is instance of being poked of fun. Junko was about to correct that last bit when she stopped. What should it be? She was poking fun of him? For some reason that didn't sound right to her all of a sudden. Ah, well, at least Andromeda didn't keep you from joining us, she said instead as she tried to stop thinking about how odd the phrase poking fun of someone sounded in her head all of a sudden. That was what it was, wasn't it? She is busy with the prince. And his relative of... Cassis paused and looked up at the ceiling. First cousins? He asked in Desvian. First cousins, Junko replied in English. Cassis nodded then and repeated the words several times as was his custom to try and get them to stick in his head. Wait, the white female is the prince's cousin? Stahl asked and looked over at Junko, who could only nod. In that raid on the library, one of the Desvians discovered a book that contains the names, details, and pictures of most of the Desvian high nobility. It's quite a thick book. I've been matching our prisoners to their details in the book, and I discovered their relationship. Though I'm not sure why Cassis didn't tell us beforehand. She looked at the Xeno, who sighed. The prince ordered me not to tell, he replied in English. Why not? Stahl asked, clearly confused. Cassis then looked at the human and seemed to set his jaw for a moment before looking away, not wanting to say, Ah, your prince wanted to have a go at his cousin. To our people she is... He paused then and looked at the ceiling. Very good? He struggled a bit and Junko spoke up. Beautiful might be the word you're looking for. Physically attractive? She spoke in English first. She'd heard somewhere that the more exposure to a language, the better for someone trying to learn it, even if they didn't catch every word. She is the kind of female that many would prefer to fuck over others, he replied, and both Junko and Stahl snorted a bit, as they each tried to keep from laughing. The perfectly frank way he said that just made it funny to both of them. "Is that Andromeda's doing?" Stahl asked quietly, and Junko nodded. "She's a terrible teacher," Junko whispered back before speaking up a bit louder. "So yes, they're cousins, and the prince wanted to go at her as you put it." "So Andromeda's made sure to keep them apart then?" Stahl asked, and Junko looked at Cassis. "Well, I haven't been in recent sessions," she hesitantly said, trying to tiptoe around the situation. "So, I'm unsure." Cassis looked between the two of them. "What is question?" he finally asked, not having followed their conversation, it seemed. "Did Andromeda let the prince and his cousin?" Junko started. Cassis slowly tilted his head up as he realized her question now. "I do not kiss and speak. Though I now distaste my task, I am sworn to him and his privacy." Junko had to resist the urge to laugh once more as she looked at the poor, proud Xeno captain trying to maintain his honor in this situation. "Well, it's really not my concern," Stahl finally admitted. "It's just unusual." "Any other surprises among our royal captives?" he asked, and Junko nodded. "Well, the prince had mentioned something about the number of brothers and sisters he has, but the book seems to be one short. I was thinking when I get the time I'd ask him about it, but each time I've been in there to try and ask, he's been busy." She blushed a little as she thought about the last time she'd walked in, and then very quickly out of Andromeda's bedroom. Cassis seemed to perk up, though, his ears twitching. "Was Prince saying number of correct brothers and sisters? Or all?" Junko arched a brow then as she tried to piece what he'd said before speaking in Desvian. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, and Cassis replied in his native tongue. "The prince has siblings that are of true royal blood shared between his parents. Then he has a number of half-brothers and sisters sired by his father but not of his mother." Junko nodded then, as she understood what the issue might be. "Ah! He's saying the prince has a number of half-brothers and sisters. It seems as though promiscuity could be a family trait." When she explained that in English to Stahl, he chuckled and shook his head. "I never understood why the Book of Lucifer spoke so poorly of monarchies. But now I'm beginning to understand that when your only qualification for leadership is the fact that you were born to the right parents, it starts to skew selective traits for continued power." Junko nodded in agreement before Stahl moved on, waving at the hollow table. "Now then, shall we explore history once more?" "Yes, please." "I'm interested in learning more," Cassis said, and then glanced at Junko, who nodded to indicate he'd said that perfectly. That made him smile, but he didn't wag his tail. Junko had started noting which ones did and which ones didn't do that when they were pleased. Since being introduced to Andromeda, the prince's tail had practically never stopped wagging. Stahl stepped forward now, activating the table. "So, I'm going to go over the first battle of Castor. It was the opening battle of the war. The real opening battle, I mean. I wanted to show you Kantis, so you understood Suvakov's style and Andromeda's origin, but this is what's considered the first battle of the conglomerate Confederate War." As he spoke, Junko saw a map come up of the Castor system. Well, one of them. She looked to Cassis then and spoke in Desvian. "Should I translate for you once more? Your English is coming along nicely, but this might get complicated." The Xeno nodded and she looked to Stahl, who then continued as she began to translate. "So, let me explain a bit. This system was once seen from our homeworld Earth as part of a constellation and known as Castor. It's a rather complicated multiple star system. There are in fact 6 different stars that orbit each other, but the main show here are these 2. He pointed to the 2 large A-class stars in the center. "Ah." Junko paused after she caught up with her translation, and then looked at Cassis. "I'm not sure that the term for these stars works in your language. We classify stars based on size, brightness, and where they are in their life cycle. These 2 are larger and brighter than the star our homeworld was based around. And they each have their own dwarf." She motioned to the smaller red dwarfs that orbited each of the larger Class A's. "Where is the planet that contains the Confederate capital, then?" he asked and examined the map. "Oh, it's not actually in this system. There's a much more stable star system one jump past it." She walked around the table to show him the way the other system was. but it was so close to this place which had been seen in the night sky of our homeworld they call it Castor Delta. But most people just call it Castor. Sorry it's a little confusing. I found many things about humanity confusing, but this isn't that bad, Cassis replied. Explaining to him where Castor the planet is instead of the star system, Stahl asked, and Junko nodded. Well, make sure he understands this next part. He motioned the two large stars. These two stars orbit each other, or really they orbit a point in the center, I suppose. But what's important is that these two big guys have two smaller red dwarfs who hang around and in general make it exceptionally difficult for our ships to jump past. He tapped on the table and pulled away from the image of the Castor system to show Cassis the larger area. This is the actual system that the capital of Castor resides. He tapped the system one jump from the multi-star system he'd shown. I believe your ships work differently, but it's difficult for us to jump around stars, and this system specifically makes it nearly impossible. However, going through this system is the only way to easily get from Congo space to the capital. He tapped on the table again, and it showed the colored lines of the rough borders of each nation. Junko took a moment to tap on Arcturus and explain to Cassis. This is the largest conglomerate system near what used to be the border between the two nations. From here they launched most of their campaigns on the other nations in this sector of space. To get to the planet of Castor, they'd either have to go through Pollux and then here or all the way around. She showed him on the map how many more Confederate systems they'd have to get through to get around. Castor just happened to be shadowed by the much large multi-star system. Why can't they just jump there from here? He asked, and pointed at the systems on either side of Pollux. I can't fully explain it to you, but Castor has two more red dwarfs that orbit Castor roughly once every 10,000 years or so, and that messes with guidance in a much larger area than most normal systems. So any line jump that crosses this area doesn't work, and these systems are too far apart for our jump drives. She pointed to more systems along either side. So either you have to jump through all these systems and essentially go through most of the Confederacy. She showed him the other inhabited systems. Or jump here and then fly past or between these stars. She tapped on Castor once more and then motioned to Stahl. He'll explain more. Stahl nodded, then hit a button which showed indicators for the Confederate 3rd through 9th fleets that were spread out wide across their territory. Though most were in systems that bordered the conglomerate, but none were in Pollux. When the Congos declared war, we weren't honestly expecting it. There wasn't any specific event that triggered it. Since that battle I showed you last time, relations between our nations had been poor, but we weren't expecting a sudden declaration of war, which is perhaps why they struck at that time. Junko was explaining this to Cassis when he asked, You didn't keep a fleet in this system? It seems odd even if you weren't expecting an attack. We keep fleets in all key systems that join our kingdom. He tapped on Pollux, and Junko quickly translated. Stahl nodded. The second fleet is normally stationed there, but had been pulled back to Castor, the planet that is for retrofits. Pollux itself was incredibly well defended. Troops on the surface, planetary defense platforms. We figured that the system could defend itself if need be. Well, the conglomerate declared war and promptly sent 5 fleets into the system. He tapped a button, and an arrow moved from Arcturus through minor systems and into Pollux. But they didn't engage the planet. They skimmed the system and jumped to Castor. They were going to try and run the gauntlet, so to speak, and hit the capital. If they could seize Castor, they had a chance to end the war in months. But, Cassis paused as Junko translated. You have a government with no king. Why is the capital this crucial? Can you not fight on? Ah, well. Junko tapped on several systems past Castor Delta. These were the Confederacy's core industrial planets. Virtually all military goods were made here. If they seized the capital right away, there were no defenses between it and the industrial worlds. They'd hold the core of the Confederacy and split it in half. Cassis nodded then. So this system, as it is place, is literally and figuratively the heart of the Confederacy then? Junko nodded and then added, Well, it was. Then she nodded for Stahl to continue. So, with 4 conglomerate fleets approaching the capital, Vice Admiral Suvakov was given command of everything they had in the system. This was the first, which was made up of freshly retrofitted heavies. Cruisers, battleships, battlecruisers, the very heaviest ships we had then. He also had the few ships from the second that weren't in dock. and the 10th Fleet, which were light escorts that mostly saw combat on the edges of our systems. These were ships designed for fighting raiders and pirates, not opposing navies. Cassis nodded as Stahl laid out the situation for him. So, Suvakov quickly realized that he lacked any carriers or an effective screening force. Sure, he had the heaviest ships in our fleet, but the Congos had a much more balanced and effective force to bring to the battle. While Castor, the planet, had plenty of defensive platforms in orbit, the Congo fleet could bypass them and strangle the system, or wear them down as reinforcements came. So he took every ship he had, and then asked for volunteers from the Confederate merchant vessels. Due to the nature of our territory, we dealt with raiders and minor incursions for the entire history of our country, so most of our merchant vessels had weapons. Truly? You allowed civilians to arm their vessels? The Xeno was clearly surprised when Junko had translated what Stahl said. It's illegal in conglomerate space, but it was historically and culturally the norm for Confederates, she explained, and Cassis nodded before motioning for Stahl to continue. So then Vice Admiral Suvakov took what he had and jumped into Castor, the multi-star system. He tapped on the table and brought back up the system from earlier, showing the 2 large stars and the smaller red dwarfs between them. At the time of the invasion, Castor Alpha and Castor Beta weren't too far apart, astronomically, and Beta's dwarf was between the primary stars. Confederates had excellent shielding technology, mostly in thanks to this system. They had to pass by stars constantly, and since Pollux was a supergiant star as well, we needed good heat shielding constantly. This seems strange to me, Cassis mentioned. You seem to live anywhere that you possibly can, even if it is difficult. We choose systems that are comfortable. Junko snorted a bit, and translated the comment to Stahl, who also chuckled. However, neither human had any real answer to his observation. So Suvakov knew the Congos were coming and took the first, and elements of the second, and positioned them here, in between Castor Beta and its dwarf. He tapped on the map to show the fleet placement. From this location, they couldn't be picked up by Congo sensors due to the background noise of the stars themselves, and the dwarf physically shielded them from visual contact. Then he had the 10th assemble with the volunteer merchantmen and begin to pass through the gap as if in convoy. He tapped the table again, and it showed the mentioned ships passing between the much wider gap between the dwarf and the larger Castor Alpha. Of course, as I mentioned last time, this map exaggerates sizes to simplify. The gap between these stars is billions of miles or something along those lines, but the fastest way to get to the jump point to Castor Delta, the planet, is going between them. He nodded at the map. When the Congos arrived, they saw what they thought was a heavily laden military convoy. Under orders, the 10th and the merchants turned to run, making it seem like they hadn't expected any hostiles. Hoping to gain supplies and intel, the Congo admiral, a man named Vasquez, ordered his frigates forward to seize the convoy. They couldn't see the ships behind this smaller star? Cassis asked in English, and Stahl nodded. Like I said, the stars made sensors useless, and you can't see through a star very easily. Even more importantly, one of the merchants was fitted with a special comm jammer that had only recently been finished, while another wasn't a merchant vessel at all, but a covert intel ship that was listening on the Congo transmissions. The frigates surge forward and the convoy moves to get behind the star. The Congos think they're using the star as protection from the bigger, slower ships, and give chase. On the table it showed the frigates moving forward, and Junko was a little surprised at how many there were. For some reason, when she'd been taught about this in school, they didn't make it seem like there had been so many ships involved. Either way, on the table, the conglomerate ships were moving to chase the escorts and merchants behind the dwarf, and right into the waiting Confederate capital ships. They split their fleet? Cassis asked then, obviously surprised. Stahl nodded. You have to remember a few points here. The Congos had won every war they'd been in. They had numerical superiority, and were used to having technological superiority, though that wasn't the case for this war. They were arrogant. They thought this attack would end the war as quickly as possible. The idea of poorly trained and undisciplined vessels breaking and running like this from a fight is just what they expected of Confederates. And their intelligence likely knew we only had the first fleet and elements of the second to defend Castor. He tapped another button then to show a ship breakdown, which Junko started to read with much curiosity herself. She definitely saw way more ships than she remembered from school. The 5 fleets they brought had 24 frigates, 16 light cruisers, a dozen heavy cruisers, 6 battleships, 2 battle cruisers, and the flagship, which was a dreadnought, largest ship in their navy at the time. Then in support they had a full 4 carriers and a dozen assault carriers for ground forces. Junko remembered the bit about the carriers, but she was positive they'd told her something different back in school about all the other ships. So, this against Suvakov's fleet, he continued and brought up the Confederate ships. A dozen light escorts and 10 light cruisers made up the 10th fleet. We had 3 heavy cruisers and an older battle cruiser from the 2nd, and then the 1st, which was full of either newly built or newly refitted ships. 8 heavy cruisers, 6 battleships, 4 battle cruisers, and our own dreadnought, which was smaller than the conglomerate flagship, but newer, so they were evenly classed. "What of the merchants?" Cassis asked in English, and Junko glanced at Stahl, who actually smiled. "Ah, you haven't forgotten. There were a dozen of them," Stahl mentioned before Cassis frowned at that. "So, then your fleet was not so badly outnumbered as you made it seem. This is 61 ships against 57, is it not?" He waved at the table. "I think you're forgetting their carriers." Stahl tapped on the conglomerate vessels. "So 65 against 57, Cassis shrugged. "I wouldn't just shrug off carriers. Each one holds 6 dozen strike craft. That's 288 more vessels to deal with. And these frigates are much larger than the light escorts I mentioned." He tapped on the table to compare the vessels. Junko studied it as well and noticed the light escorts were indeed quite a bit smaller. They had crews of 400 men while the frigates carried 1,500 each. "So these escorts are more like corvettes. Perhaps your light cruisers are more like our destroyers then," Cassis mentioned before Stahl tapped on the table once more to bring up a comparison between the Confederate and conglomerate light cruisers. When Junko noticed they were each crewed by around 8,000 people, she spoke up. "I have a question. Why does it take so many people to crew these things?" Both officers looked at her and she suddenly felt a little out of place, but continued. "I mean, those light cruisers are just shy of a kilometer long, I know, but it still seems like a lot of people. Like, a lot. Every system in the ship needs people to maintain it, and you need shifts of people to make sure someone is always doing the job. You need cooks to feed the people doing maintenance. You need gunners, you need communications personnel, you need a lot of people to maintain ships like this. The merchants have considerably less crew for their size, but that's because they aren't military. All our ships need to be working at full capacity as much as possible, because you never know when you're going to be attacked. Any of these ships could be crewed by a third of the crew and function, but not well. It should also be noted that these systems are made more cumbersome by necessity of their simplicity," Stahl mentioned, though Junko arched an eyebrow at that last part. "Could you explain?" she asked. "What I mean is, we didn't crew our ships entirely with college graduates who understood starship engineering or energy systems or anything like that. These are sailors, high school graduates mostly. So the ships have to be designed by experts and then maintained by not exerts. Often these make the systems more cumbersome but simpler. So more people but less skilled labor," he shrugged. Junko nodded then but wondered why more wasn't done to automate things. Then again, isn't that what the conglomerate had started to do? And why Andromeda had ejected all those sailors into the void? She shuddered. "Please continue," she finally mentioned, and Stahl shrugged. "From here on out, the battle is actually surprisingly straightforward. The escorts and merchants pull around the dwarf and the frigates give chase. The merchants are built with their weapons and shields focused in the back, since they're mostly running rather than charging into a fight, which actually worked to our favor here. They were able to strike at the approaching frigates, who needed to close the distance to knock out their engines to seize what goods they had and drew them into the ambush. Once the majority of frigates were out of sight of the rest of the conglomerate fleet, the signal jammer was activated and the ambush began. On the table, she saw the frigates rush forward around the dwarf just like he'd mentioned and fall straight into the trap. The Confederate capital ships laid into the smaller, less defended vessels and tore them apart. While this was happening, I mentioned one of the merchants was a secret intelligence ship earlier. They picked up the signals the frigates were trying to send out and copied one to send to the conglomerate fleet, claiming that the fight was going well, but resistance was stronger than anticipated and they wanted backup. Junko finished translating that part for Cassis and then spoke up. How did they copy it so quickly? Wouldn't it have been encrypted? Ah yes, but Confederate intelligence was exceptional. Aside from the fact that they completely missed the conglomerate's intent to invade us so soon. They were thinking it wouldn't be for several more years, so they had most of the Congo naval codes already broken. They just needed to know which set these fleets were using. Junko nodded and translated that stuff for Cassis before Stahl went on. So this is one of the important parts of what would happen. Vasquez sent his remaining cruisers, both light and heavy, and his battleships to assist, but he held his dreadnought, battlecruisers, and carriers back. He was worried that the desperate Confederates might try and ram his most important ships. He also didn't deploy the fighters and bombers from the carriers, since he felt it was a waste of time to fit them with the special shielding they'd need to operate so close to stars. At this point in the battle, our fleet had taken light losses, half the escorts, and 5 of the cruisers in exchange for their entire complement of frigates. "Where were you?" Cassis suddenly asked, and Stahl arched a brow. "You were officer in this, yes?" the Xeno asked, and then Stahl nodded, tapping a light cruiser, the CSS Ranger. "I had just been made a provisional captain only 2 weeks before this all happened." Speaking of, Suvakov was only vice admiral? Why would they not give this fleet to an admiral? Cassis then asked. Because the admiral who would normally control this fleet had just retired. Suvakov was on Castor to be evaluated for position of admiral and was the only officer good enough to manage this defense who was already in the system, so he was given command and sent off. They'd make him a full admiral after the battle. He nodded and then tapped the map once more. As the heavier Congo ships approached, the merchants did break and run, having no interest in getting tangled up in that fight. Junko saw the indicators on the map running from the battle while the rest of the Confederate fleet engaged the new targets rounding the dwarf. The map got confusing as these forces engaged, and she noticed that there wasn't much positioning but simply ships hitting each other with everything they had. But the rest of the conglomerate ships, the dreadnought, battlecruisers, carriers, and landing craft, all continued on their route, which was taking them closer to the dwarf. This part of the battle went on for about 2 hours. He was quiet after mentioning that, and Junko watched the indicators on the table flash from solid to gray as ship after ship was lost. She couldn't imagine the sort of battle this must have been like if what she was watching was really 2 hours worth of battle. All those people. In the end, we lost all the escorts, half our heavy cruisers, and mine was the only light cruiser still operational. But we didn't lose anything heavier. My ship and the 2 most badly damaged but still functional heavy cruisers were tasked with search and rescue of the remains of the battle. We saved Congos and Confederates that day. Junko looked at Stahl as he said that, and she noticed the sadness in his eyes. She was positive he must have lost friends that day. But he took a breath and continued. Taking the rest of the fleet, Suvakov rounded the dwarf and approached Vasquez's flagship. Realizing he'd been played, Vasquez ordered the carriers and landing craft to retreat, while he positioned his ship and the battle cruisers between the approaching Confederates and the now retreating carriers. He understood he wasn't getting out of this one, considering that now he was significantly outnumbered. Junko nodded, as she expected Stahl to mention Vasquez's last stand. Realizing that the carriers were already too far to be caught by his heavier, slower ships, Suvakov offered Vasquez terms to surrender. His ships would be seized, but only after the carriers had made their jump to Pollux. Junko leaned back at that, not even translating. But he refused and fought to the last right? She'd never heard about the surrender option, but Stahl looked confused. What? No. He took the deal. Once the carriers jumped, he struck his colors and surrendered his ships. By this point, Suvakov had become better known for his honor. He never apologized for Contis, but he never struck a surrendered ship again. The ships were seized and would go on to be refitted and renamed before used in our navy later in the war. Some of the crew joined us while the rest remained in military prisons until the end of the war. "That's not what I was taught at all," Junko exclaimed, now surprised. "You're not making this up to look better?" she asked, and Stahl laughed. "Junko, we lost the war. I now serve a bloodthirsty pirate who is your boss. I have no need to try to make a battle long over look better for the Confederacy." Vasquez surrendered. But with his carriers safe, Suvakov had to delay his counterattack and wait for Confederate carriers to join him in Pollux. After that, our fleets all across the border systems invaded conglomerate space. We took serious ground in those first few years, but never enough to get the Congos to surrender, and in the end we were worn down by a battle of attrition. Vasquez died of a heart attack shortly before the end of the war, but he didn't sacrifice his last ships that day. Stahl seemed very honest, and Junko couldn't imagine a reason for him to lie about this. That's not what they taught me at all, she said. Who taught you what? Junko turned, then surprised to hear Andromeda behind her. But sure enough, the red-headed pirate was right behind her with the prince by her side. He was wearing a now much cleaner uniform than when they'd found him, and was much better groomed. He looked quite happy with himself at the moment. In school during the war, we were told that Vasquez in the First Battle of Castor had a heroic last stand that kept the Confederate ships from chasing the carriers, and likely saved the conglomerate from greater losses early in the war. They also made it seem like you had a lot more ships than you apparently did. Andromeda laughed at that. Fucking propaganda. I bet if Vasquez had survived the war, he wouldn't have made it home. He'd have complicated their little story. No, he handled that battle terribly. Hell, if he had run instead of waited for my father's ships to bear down on him, he'd have escaped with the carriers. But he waited, probably thinking he'd make a last stand like you said, but my father knew he couldn't catch those carriers anyway, so he offered him surrender terms and didn't lose any more of his own ships. Maybe the war I was taught is inaccurate in other ways, Junko mentioned as she looked back at the table. To be fair, we lied about a few things here and there ourselves, Andromeda mentioned. Like what? Stahl asked, sounding a bit hurt by the accusation. Like the Battle of the Zavari Traverse, Andromeda mentioned, and Stahl frowned. What did we make up about that? Granted, I wasn't there, but I'm not sure what we lied about. Junko looked to Andromeda as Stahl spoke again, now even more curious. Well, let's see what time it is. Andromeda looked at her wrist, which made Junko sigh because the pirate didn't have a watch on her power armor wrist, but instead did that when she wanted Junko to check. So she glanced at her tablet. It's 15:30 ship time, she answered. Well, I'll explain as we walk. Come on, everyone, to the bridge! She waved them all out of the museum, and as they left, Junko saw the lifeguard fall into place around them. We'll be jumping soon into a neutral system where the Germo have set up a fuel trade for us with the locals. Anyway, without that hollow table, I can explain the battle to you really easily. Without the hollow table and proper context, he'll lack the full scope of the battle, Stahl protested, but Andromeda just waved a hand dismissively. He doesn't need much context for what I've got to say about it. Have you been following along? She looked back at Cassis. I've missed things since Executive Assistant Junko stopped translating. He replied, and Junko realized that she'd totally forgotten. Oh, let me get you caught up. She quickly filled him in on what she'd learned about the end of that battle, which was different from what she'd been taught. Before she could go into more detail about the war, Andromeda cut back in, now speaking Desvian. So, years down the line, we'd started to lose our recently acquired territory as the conglomerate got their war machine up to speed. They'd gone through several major admirals, all who lost time and again to Suvakov and got replaced. They had a very long string of just terrible commanders who didn't know how to handle the war. Anyway, in a system called the Zavari Traverse, they set up an ambush. There were a bunch of asteroid fields in the system, and they hid ships in them while my father brought his fleet into the edge of the system. Then they made it look like some wounded carriers were passing by the asteroid fields, trying to get back to safe territory. They wanted to draw him into the asteroid fields where they had a much larger fleet waiting. Well, he didn't go for it. So far, what Andromeda had said sounded exactly like what she'd been taught, and they were soon piling into the large lift that would take them up to the bridge as her boss went on. So then they tried some convoy vessels and supply ships, sort of dangling them right in front of my father's fleet, but once more he didn't budge. Then they finally get tired of waiting and advance out of the asteroid fields to attack my father's fleet head-on. Across open space, Confederate gunners had much more experience and began to open up on them. But to seal the deal, another Confederate fleet jumped into the system and crushed the Congos in between them. It was a huge disaster for the Congos and delayed their counterattack by at least a year. So what's the lie? Cassis asked. Well, afterwards, everyone said he was a genius for seeing through the trap and not falling for it, and waiting for the friendly fleet to arrive. But in truth, he told his fleet to hold position because he wasn't ready for a battle at the start. He had the runs. She laughed then and could see Cassis and the prince look confused. Diarrhea. Gut-wrenching ass explosions that made him feel like he was shitting fire. Cassis and Junko both grimaced and looked disgusted, but the prince just laughed. Oh, how wonderful she is. The language she uses so freely. Why couldn't I meet a human baroness sooner? Cassis, I think she'd make a fine queen. Don't you? The prince jabbed Cassis in the ribs with his elbow, and Junko noticed the older Zeno scowl for a moment, before his face went totally blank and neutral, and she heard more of an accent from him than she had since his capture. Yes, sir, your royal highness. A great queen, sir. What was that about? So yeah, the history books say he didn't fall for the trap because he was such a great commander. But in reality, he was in the bathroom busy emptying everything in his guts. He had only just gotten it under control when they attacked, and our friendly fleet had no idea the Congos were there. It was just a happy accident. Andromeda laughed once more, and Stahl spoke up. Since I don't know Zeno talk, what did she say we lied about? Junko looked over her shoulder at the officer. She said he didn't fall for the Congo trap in the Traverse because he had the runs and was indisposed. She decided not to directly translate Andromeda's words. Ah, I never knew that, he said and nodded. Well, that's hardly the same sort of lie. What were you taught about that battle? Just what it seems happened, except for the diarrhea part. We just thought he was too smart to fall for the trap. She also mentioned how many fleet admirals we went through, which, now that I think about it, we did constantly. But after that very first battle, Suvakov was given command of the Confederate Navy, and he held that position until the end, didn't he? Almost, Stahl corrected. Andromeda was acting commander for the Second Battle of Castor at the very end of the war. The official war, at any rate. Junko nodded at that. How could she have forgotten the infamous Second Battle of Castor? Soon they were departing the elevator and walking out through the halls to the bridge. Junko began to wonder what else she'd been lied to about in school. She supposed that the bit about the last stand didn't really change anything since the ships and crew were still lost. But it did mean that the Confederacy had 2 more battlecruisers and a dreadnought for the early part of the war. That entire invasion seemed so poorly planned. If they were invading a system, why just send 5 fleets like that? And why smaller fleets? Now she had all sorts of questions to try and answer. Once they were out on the bridge, she looked at the large screen up front. She looked at the holes and gashes along the Retribution's hull, the damage this beast had taken during that Second Battle of Castor. She wondered why Andromeda never spoke about it. She was pulled out of her musings, however, when Cassis stepped up next to her away from the others and spoke quietly. Have you had a chance to talk to the nobles? Get some information about their studies? Yes. I interviewed them to make sure they matched their descriptions in the book I have. It seems like, she bit her lower lip then as she looked into the eyes of the Zeno. Is it that bad? He finally asked. Well, it's not great. None of them seemed to have any sort of leadership training. Plus, while they knew basic math, that seemed to be the extent of their math studies, though they're apparently well-versed in poetry and literature. She tried to cheer him up a bit. Their cultural studies really sound in depth, and maybe this is just the group that liked to hang out with the prince, so maybe it's not that bad. And your niece? Oh, she's very bright. She knew way more than anyone else, and she's very nice, and to be honest, totally out of place among the others. I appreciate that. But he glanced back at the prince who was next to Andromeda, laughing about something. In the days since he came out of the vault, I have had increasingly less interest in being ruled by that man someday. Well, I think Andromeda would be happy to hear that. Though, I don't know what it will mean for our efforts here. She was thinking about what to say next when Andromeda spoke up. All right! We're jumping, everyone. This will be our first contact with a new species that's supposed to be neutral and friendly, and they're offering us fuel at a decent price, so be on your best behavior. Junko had been in the room with Andromeda, Yonatan the Germo, and Avi when they'd negotiated the deal. For some reason, the Germo had done it with themselves as the middlemen, but weren't charging anything for the service. Avi didn't trust them still, but Junko just thought they wanted to make sure Andromeda used them as her go-betweens. She looked forward once more and the empty space was replaced. She could see a star in the distance, and much closer were a number of ships that looked like fat freighters and the like. "All right, that should be them. Bring them up on the screen," Andromeda mentioned. Junko looked up as the new Xenos were brought into focus for all of a second before gasping and looking at her feet. "Oh my God!" she gasped out, and she could hear gasps all around. But Andromeda wasn't content with a gasp. "What the fuck? Jesus Christ! Its face is upside down, and it's got pustules on its throat or something, and fucking sphincters on its face? What the shit is that? Oh, Lucifer, it's disgusting. Someone kill it with fire!" That's when Junko heard the Xeno quickly speak up. "Well, wait. Please, no, don't. You are transmitting. We can hear you." "Yeah, I'm aware of that," Andromeda stated, and Junko carefully focused on her boss, not wanting to look at the screen again. "You're the ugliest thing I've ever seen. I don't even want to share this galaxy with you." "Fuck! Oh, what the hell is that appendage? Where did that come from? And what's that? Damn it, bring the weapons online already." "Wait!" It screeched out once more, and then said something quickly in its own language, which to Junko sounded like something was simultaneously throwing up and hacking phlegm. A sound so gross it almost made her throw up as she looked at the ground and closed her eyes, trying to clear the Xeno from her memory. "There. The transmission is off. You don't see me? Just hear me. So hear me out. We'll give you all the fuel you wanted for free. No charge. Sign of goodwill between our people. Don't kill us." Junko slowly looked up, and then relaxed as she saw the screen was indeed black. Andromeda was quiet for a moment before speaking up. "I'll pay you half what we agreed upon because I want you to take the money and use it to make masks. Or better yet, whole suits where we don't have to see you the next time any human does business with your people. Is that understood?" "Yes. Yes! We accept!" the Xeno desperately agreed. "And you'll move away from your airlocks, so when our crew boards your ship, they won't see any of you. Got it?" she added. "Yes, of course. Well, we're sorry our appearance has so offended you, mighty pirate baroness." We are grateful for your mercy." Junko realized this wasn't a good start to relations between their people, but that was the single most disgusting creature she had ever seen. And from what Andromeda said, it seemed like she hadn't even seen the worst of it. "Well, then get to work." She made a throat-cutting gesture with her hand, and the transmission was ended. "Junko, get some work teams assembled to head over to their ships. Make sure they're fitted with full hazmat suits and thermal imaging. I don't want them using regular vision around those Xenos if they see them. No one deserves to see that. Shit, who knew evolution could be so fucked up?" She looked at Cassis then and switched to Desvian. "I'm guessing the architects didn't design those?" "Ah, no. But I'm glad I haven't eaten recently," Cassis admitted. "Normally I'd feel such heavy-handed threats were in poor taste, but for once I can't agree more with your command they never show their faces again." "I second that," Junko muttered and began tapping on her tablet to assemble the crews as instructed. She just hoped the crew didn't slaughter the Xenos in horror if they did show up. If she were on an unknown vessel and one of those things popped out, she was fairly sure she'd kill it however possible herself. Though she now wondered how lucky they were to have not met a species like this until now. If every other species looked like that, she was fairly sure humanity would have tried band together to purge the galaxy of life centuries ago.